Imagine owning a peaceful, private lake, only to have an entitled HOA Karen claim it belongs to the entire neighborhood. At first, it's just annoying notices and fake fines. But when she realizes she's losing control, she does the unthinkable. A gun, a standoff, and a showdown no one saw coming. How far will Karen go to take what isn't hers? Stay tuned, because this HOA nightmare turns into a battle for survival. A peaceful neighborhood, the kind where everyone minds their own business and waves politely while mowing their lawn. A place where life should be simple, until someone like Karen decides otherwise. Everything was fine until she appeared, clipboard in one hand, a deep sense of self-importance in the other. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-proclaimed ruler of the HOA, a walking, talking violation notice factory. She had an uncanny ability to detect infractions that didn't exist, like the color of someone's mailbox being too aggressive or a lawn gnome that disrupted the visual harmony of the street. The protagonist, a laid-back homeowner who simply wanted to enjoy their property, including their legally owned private lake, became Karen's next target. She wasn't just concerned with garden decorations this time. No, she had set her sights on something bigger. She believed the lake belonged to the community. Not based on facts, mind you, but on sheer force of will. At first, it seemed like a misunderstanding. A neighbor's mistake, maybe? But as soon as the protagonist politely corrected her, Karen doubled down. She wasn't just wrong, she was determined to prove she was right, even if it meant rewriting reality. And thus, the battle for the lake began. Karen was never one to let facts get in the way of her authority. The moment she decided the lake was community property, she acted as though it had always been so. First came the notices. Official-looking papers taped to the protagonist's door, printed in bold, self-important font. Violation notice. Unauthorized private use of a community water feature. Immediate compliance required. The protagonist blinked. A water feature? It was a lake. One that came with the property deed. Karen didn't care. She showed up on the doorstep, smug as ever, arms crossed like a principal waiting for a confession. "You can't claim something that belongs to the neighborhood," she declared. "It's selfish." "No, Karen. It's mine," the protagonist replied, handing over legal documents proving the lake was private property. Karen's eyes scanned the paperwork, lips pursed like she had just bitten into an unripe lemon. Then she scoffed. "Well, that just doesn't seem fair." From that moment, her campaign to reclaim the lake began. She started small, telling neighbors that the protagonist was hoarding a natural resource. Then came the absurd, entirely made-up HOA rules. HOA regulations clearly state that all water bodies must be accessible to residents. Spoiler: no, they don't. Private lakes don't exist in HOA communities. Except when they do, like in the title deed she refused to acknowledge. When the protagonist pointed this out, Karen huffed. "We'll see about that." She printed maps with the lake conveniently shaded in community green and distributed them to neighbors as official HOA documentation. She even started telling kids they could fish there, encouraging families to picnic on the shore, as if the lake had magically become a public park overnight. The protagonist, watching from their deck, could only shake their head. Karen wasn't just making rules. She was rewriting reality to suit her narrative. And unfortunately for her, the protagonist wasn't about to let that happen. The protagonist tried reasoning with Karen, but expecting her to admit she was wrong was like expecting a cat to file taxes. Completely impossible. When confronted with the property deed again, Karen gasped as if she had just been personally betrayed. "You can't just own a lake," she scoffed. "That's not how nature works." "Actually, Karen, that's exactly how property ownership works." But logic had no place in Karen's world. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. The notices started piling up, each one more absurd than the last. Violation notice. Failure to provide community water access. Second notice. Unauthorized private use of a shared natural resource. Final warning. HOA board to review consequences of non-compliance. The protagonist chuckled, tossing each one into the trash where it belonged. Karen wanted to play games, so be it. First, the protagonist put up a very legal, very official private property, a no trespassing sign near the lake. A direct response to Karen's attempts at hosting impromptu community gatherings on their land. Then they began subtly undermining her nonsense. "Karen, HOA regulations state all lakes must be accessible to residents. Protagonist, great. Show me where that's written. Karen, flipping through a blank HOA rulebook. It's understood. Karen, we'll see what the HOA has to say about this. Protagonist, perfect. I'll bring my lawyer to the meeting. Karen, blinking rapidly, that won't be necessary. Karen, it's just unfair to keep the lake all to yourself. Protagonist, you have a bathtub, right? That's technically water access. At first, Karen seemed unfazed, but cracks started to show. The more the protagonist laughed off her ridiculous claims, the more desperate she became. Then came the biggest escalation yet. Karen threatened to fine the protagonist. A fine. For using their own lake. This wasn't just an HOA overreach. It was full-blown delusion. The protagonist knew at that moment. This was only going to get worse. Word spread fast. Karen had officially declared war on the lake, and the neighborhood was eating up the drama like it was a primetime reality show. Some neighbors sided with Karen, either too scared to cross her or genuinely buying into her delusion. She says the lake is technically connected to the neighborhood drainage system, so it belongs to everyone. Isn't she on the HOA board? She must know something we don't. Others? They saw right through her nonsense. Tom from next door, a longtime victim of Karen's HOA tyranny, approached the protagonist with a smirk. Last week she accused my cat of trespassing. Your cat? She said it was loitering. Then there was Linda, who had been fighting a 6-month-long battle over the color of her front door. She told me taupe was too aggressive for the neighborhood's aesthetic. One by one, neighbors started sharing their Karen horror stories. Bob got fined for leaving his trash can out 5 minutes past pickup time. Alice received a notice about excessively loud wind chimes. Someone even claimed Karen tried to regulate how many holiday lights they could use in December. The protagonist quickly realized Karen had been ruling with an iron fist for years. No, she was losing control. As Karen continued to push her fake lake rules, something strange happened. People stopped taking her seriously. At a neighborhood gathering, one resident loudly joked, "What's next? HOA-approved ducks." Another chimed in, "No, community-controlled fish." Laughter spread and Karen's face turned red. She wasn't just fighting for the lake anymore. She was fighting to keep her grip on power. And she was starting to realize she was losing. Karen wasn't just losing, she was unraveling. The more the protagonist ignored her ridiculous demands, the more desperate she became. It started with petty escalation. One morning, the protagonist caught her trespassing on their property, measuring the grass by the lake with a ruler. HOA regulations state lawns must be uniform in height. She snapped, waving her clipboard. Karen, that's not even part of my lawn. It's my lakefront. Still counts. Then she filed fake complaints. New HOA violations. Water hazard due to unregulated fish. Unauthorized reflections on community property. Failure to maintain uniform wave patterns. Yes. She literally tried to fine the protagonist for how the water moved. But her most outrageous move yet came when she stormed into the HOA meeting with a massive binder labeled Neighborhood Offenders. Inside, screenshots, printed Google Maps images, and laughably bad hand-drawn diagrams proving the lake belonged to the HOA. "As you can see," she declared, slamming the binder on the table, "this lake is in direct alignment with our community's water flow, which means it is, by extension, shared property." The HOA board, already tired of Karen's antics, exchanged looks. The protagonist stood up, calmly slid a copy of their property deed across the table, and spoke just 4 words. "This is legally mine." The room went silent. Karen blinked. She flipped through her ridiculous binder, desperately searching for a counterargument. She had nothing. One HOA member cleared their throat. "Karen, this isn't how property ownership works." Another sighed. "You can't just claim someone else's land." And just like that, the cracks turned into full collapse. Her own allies began questioning her. The board announced they would review her behavior and her abuse of power. Karen, for the first time ever, looked nervous. But she wasn't done. Not yet. That night, the protagonist heard footsteps near the lake. Karen wasn't going to let this go. And what happened next? Nobody saw coming. It happened late at night. The neighborhood was quiet, the moon casting a silver glow over the lake. The protagonist had just stepped outside, enjoying the peace that Karen had spent weeks trying to destroy. Then they saw movement. A shadow near the water. A familiar clipboard-wielding silhouette creeping along the shore. Karen. The protagonist sighed. Of course. Karen, it's over, they called out. The HOA already ruled against you. Go home. But Karen didn't move. Instead, she turned, pulling something from her purse, and before the protagonist could process it, they were staring down the barrel of a gun. You don't understand, she hissed, voice shaking, not with fear but with rage. This lake belongs to the community. The protagonist froze. This wasn't just another HOA tantrum. Karen had snapped. She held the gun in one hand, still gripping her clipboard in the other, as if violations and violence were interchangeable. I won't let you steal what belongs to everyone, she continued, her breath ragged. The protagonist, carefully keeping their hands visible, took a step back. Karen, you are insane. She flinched at the word, her grip tightening. The protagonist knew they had two choices: stall or run. So they went with option 3, call her bluff. You realize you're threatening me with a gun? Over a lake? They said slowly. You're literally holding a weapon while arguing about ducks and property lines. For the first time, Karen hesitated. Reality seemed to flicker in her eyes, like part of her knew she had gone way too far. And that's when the flashing red and blue lights appeared. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor had seen the insanity unfolding and called the police. Within seconds, officers swarmed the scene. Drop the weapon. Karen whirled around, panicked, her face twisting from rage to pure disbelief. This is all a misunderstanding, she shrieked. But it was too late. The gun hit the ground. Karen hit her knees. And just like that, her reign over the neighborhood was over. The moment Karen was in cuffs, the entire neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The officers led her away, still ranting about community rights and unfair lake monopolies. But no one was listening. The protagonist watched as she was placed in the back of the police car, muttering about how she would sue everyone for emotional distress. Then the officer turned to the protagonist. So, she pulled a gun on you over a lake? The protagonist nodded. Homeowners associations are wild, the officer muttered, shaking his head. With Karen officially arrested, the fallout was swift. Karen faces legal consequences. Charged with trespassing, making threats, and unlawful firearm use. The HOA, desperate to distance themselves from her, immediately removed her from any leadership role. Fined for every single fake violation she ever issued. And the best part? She violated her own HOA rules by having a firearm in a restricted area, meaning she was now getting hit with her own brand of ridiculous fines. Karma. The neighborhood celebrates. Once the dust settled, the neighborhood decided it was time for a little celebration. Someone made cupcakes with "By Karen" written in frosting. The protagonist even threw a small lakeside barbecue, now 100% Karen-free. Neighbors laughed, swapped Karen horror stories, and for the first time in years, they relaxed. No more pointless fines. No more clipboard inspections. No more HOA dictatorship. Just peace, quiet, and a private lake that remained private. The protagonist's final victory. The lake remained untouched, exactly as it should be. The protagonist took a long, satisfied look at the water, enjoying the view without someone screaming about HOA regulations in the distance. And with a smirk, they muttered, Karen never returned to the neighborhood. Whether she moved away in shame or simply went into hiding, no one really knew or cared. The HOA, eager to regain its credibility, made some much-needed changes. Less micromanaging, fewer nonsense rules, and most importantly, no more rogue dictators with clipboards. The neighborhood thrived. The grass grew a little taller. The holiday lights shined a little brighter. And best of all, people could now walk outside without fearing a violation notice for existing. As for the protagonist, they did exactly what they planned to do from the start. They enjoyed their lake in peace. Sitting on their porch one evening, watching the sunset reflect off the water, they thought back to Karen's final ridiculous argument. You can't just own a lake. The protagonist smirked. Sure I can, Karen. Sure I can.